Welcome everyone to the School of Education's monthly Brown Bag Global Education Colloquium. My name is Christy Kelly and I'm one of the faculty member here in the School of Ed. And we want to thank so many of you for coming in person, as well as we've got quite a few people online as well. So just to kind of give an introduction, the Global Education Colloquium meets once a month. We invite scholars to come and present their research and to let us know what future projects they're also working on. Those of you that are online, we ask you to write your questions into the chat box via YouTube, and we'll make sure to ask your questions at the end of the talk. For those of you in the room, welcome, and we'll also make sure you have plenty of time for question and answer at the end. So today we're very excited to have Rebecca Tarlow, who is a faculty member at Penn State in Education and Labor Studies, and she will be presenting on her book, which just came out this year. Congratulations, we're really excited. The book is titled Occupying Schools, Occupying Land, How the Landless Workers Movement Transformed Brazilian Education, and it's available through Oxford University Press. If you'd like half off of the book, we're excited to have copies here, and you can purchase them directly from our speaker at the end of the day. Dr. Tarlow was inspired to pursue a career in education by her experiences with community organizing in Latin America and the United States, where she witnessed the potential education has to advance economic and racial justices in poor communities. She is compelled by the question, what role does education play in facilitating social change, both within formal systems of schooling and in informal contexts? She completed her doctorate in social and cultural studies and education at the University of California, Berkeley, and she completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford University. Her research agenda has three broad areas of focus: theories of the state and state-society relations, social movements, critical pedagogy and learning, and Latin American education and development. Her scholarship engages in debates in the fields of political sociology, international and comparative education, social movements, critical pedagogy, global and transnational sociology, and social theory. We're very excited to have Dr. Tarlow here today to present her findings, which you will be able to read more about in her book. But with that, I welcome you to the front.
Thank you all for coming. What Christy didn't say is that last year I tried to come to give the same talk, and there was a big snow blizzard, and so I wasn't able to make it. But today was 45 degrees and sunny, so luckily I was able to come. And thank you so much to Christy for inviting me to come year after year despite the snow. And also to the Global Educational Colloquium. It's so important to think about education, not just in the US context, but as a lens through which to understand global processes, which I know is the focus of your program. So great to be here. As Christy mentioned, I'm going to be talking about my book that just got printed, released. It's called Occupying Schools, Occupying Land, How the Landless Workers Movement Transformed Brazilian Education. And as Christy also alluded to, I didn't get interested in this topic as an academic, but rather as an activist who was embedded in the student movement, the anti-war movement, and the anti-sweatshop movement as an undergraduate. And when I was a junior in college, I had the opportunity to go to Brazil for the first time, and I worked with a feminist organization in the northeast of the country whose goal was to end all forms of sexism, racism, and class oppression, which I thought were pretty good goals. And so I asked the founder of the organization, Lourdes, how they plan to do that. And she pointed to a picture of a person. Can anyone guess who she pointed to? One person. Paulo Freire, right? So Paulo Freire, who's the Brazilian educational theorist who wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And what this organization was doing is they were using Freirean theories Freirean ideas about education in order to raise the consciousness of people in the community and engage them in social change struggles. And so for that month with them, I watched as they would, for example, bring together elder women in the community to read the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And then they would talk about whether or not they actually had those rights in their community, and if not, what to do about it. And so at a very young age, I became obsessed with this idea of education as a pedagogy of social change. And I was really curious why our own social movements in the United States didn't have these types of grassroots educational programs. And so I went to grad school to find out more about social movement-led educational initiatives. However, when I got to my social and cultural studies program at UC Berkeley, rather than learn about educational alternatives, we read theory after theory after theory about why public education systems are oppressive institutions that simply reproduce social and economic and racial inequities. And so I began to wonder, is it possible for public schools to have the radical educational pedagogies I had seen in Northeast Brazil? And so my dissertation, which became this book, shifted to this question of how social movements use public education as one component of their larger social struggle. And so the driving questions of the book are basically how can and do social movements work within, through, and outside of the state to promote their broader social and economic goals? And what is the role of public education in processes of social reproduction and resistance? And so the big lesson I learned from this research, and the take-home point for all of you today, is that social movements in Brazil aren't simply contesting the state, but rather they're doing what Rudy Dutschke, who's a German student activist, called, drawing on Antonio Gramsci, an Italian Marxist, the long march through the institutions. In other words, these social movements aren't just contesting against the state, but are rather working within the state. And so when we talk about this long march through the institutions, social movements engage in this long march when they enter the state, helping to carry out the daily job of public service provision, while linking those actions to a broader process of social struggle and a long-term strategy for economic and political change. This means contesting power in all state spheres, whether that's universities or schools or local transportation offices or sanitation services or local governance. In other words, social movements in Brazil have gained tremendous power by working with, in, through, and against the state to promote their social and economic values and goals in all spheres of life that affect people's daily ongoing lives. And in the book, what I argue is that this strategy of the long march through the institutions is the main reason why social movements in Brazil have been able to be relevant and effective for the past 30 years. Jason. So, of course, the social movement in Brazil that most emphasizes this long march strategy is the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, or the MST. So raise your hand if you've heard of the MST. Okay, so only half the room. I'll give a little bit of history. The Brazilian Landless Workers Movement is one of the largest social movements in Latin America, if not the largest. However, it started during a period of dictatorship, and it started due to the unequal land distribution that existed throughout Brazil, where very few people owned the majority of the land, and the majority of people were landless. It didn't start as a united movement, but rather groups of landless farmers who were inspired by the Catholic Church and liberation theology and decided to take the issue of poverty into their own hands and contest this issue of land distribution by actually occupying unproductive land estates and trying to convince or pressure the government to take up to expropriate this land and redistribute it to landless farmers. Even during a period of dictatorship, this strategy of land occupation and squatting actually worked. And the government began to give land access to farmers and families throughout the southern part of Brazil. And so in 1984, the leaders of these dispersed land occupations decided to come together, and they founded a national movement, the Brazilian Landless Workers Movement, or the MST, Movimento Sem Terra, with this phrase, "the land belongs to those who work it." Over the past 35 years, the movement has expanded to include 1.5 million women, men, and children with 350,000 families that have gotten land rights. That's a ton of people who were previously landless and now have land. The movement continues to occupy land estates that are unproductive to this day. And you can't really see this picture, can you? But this is actually a picture of a land occupation that I participated in 2011. With 1,000 other people, when right before the activists broke through the gates, they shouted to me, "Rebecca, Rebecca, jump over the gates and take a picture." And so I was able to capture this amazing picture you can't really see of a land occupation in process. which just goes to show why ethnography is the best methodology, because it's very exciting. Currently, the MST articulates its goals in terms of land reform, agrarian reform, and social transformation. So although access to land or land reform is one aspect of agrarian reform, getting land doesn't give you the ability to live a dignified life on the land, by which you're going to need houses and roads and technical assistance and, of course, schools. The MST's goal of social transformation is its most controversial goal because it openly critiques capitalism and it embraces historical attempts to construct socialism. In addition, over the past 30 years, the MST's goal of social transformation has evolved to include racial justice, indigenous rights, gender equity, and most recently, LGBTQ working class rights. Education is a key part of all of these goals. And I would argue that although the MST is most famous for its agrarian reform struggle, its transformation of the rural public school system might end up being its lasting legacy. Over the past 35 years, the movement has gotten access to more than 2,000 public schools with 8,000 teachers and 250,000 students. All of these schools are run by either state or municipal governments. And these governments often allow local MST activists to engage in the co-governance of these schools, implementing pedagogies that encourage youth to stay in the countryside, that foster activism and more collective forms of work. And so that's been really amazing in the public school system, but in addition, the movement has actually partnered with 80 different higher education systems to offer adult education, high school, and higher education programs throughout the country, affecting hundreds of thousands of students. All of these programs are what you could call affirmative action programs for land occupation participants, because you're only allowed to enroll in this program if you've gotten land through a land occupation, or your parents, or if you're currently illegally squatting on land and occupying it. And so this program has transformed the MST in less than a decade from a movement of farmers with usually a 5th grade education to a movement of farmers with college education and beyond. So those are some pretty amazing accomplishments, would you agree? And more so, those accomplishments really go against a lot of the arguments in the academic literature. Specifically in the sociology of social movements, there's a really strong argument that social movements inevitably become more conservative and less effective as they institutionalize. This argument goes back to a guy named Robert Michels, who created this idea of the iron rule of oligarchy, which is that organizations become more oligarchical over time. And also Piven and Cloward's argument about the civil rights movement that disruptive protest is the only effective form of protest. Nonetheless, over the past 25 years, there's been more nuanced analyses. People like Sonia Alvarez will argue that feminist movements really use a dual strategy of working both within and outside of the state. You'll have a recent book by Tiana Paschel. If you haven't read it, it's amazing. It talks about how the Black movements in Colombia and Brazil really transformed the state through huge land titling programs and affirmative action programs. In addition, there's a whole body of literature on theories of participatory democracy in Latin America. And these scholars have been telling us for 30 years that yes, social movements in Brazil have demanded access to the state while at the same time demanding autonomy of their organizations from the state. And so anyway, there's in the academic literature, there's a lot of nuanced arguments about social movements' relationship to the state. However, I would argue about this question of how social movements should engage the state continues to vex both academics and activists. For example, the Zapatista movement is often embraced for choosing the strategy that's exactly the opposite of the MST in creating counter-institutions outside of the state realm. The Occupy movement in Zuccotti Park totally divided over the question of whether to make demands on the state or whether to create the perfect social world in the confines of Zuccotti Park. The Chilean student movement has also had big divides on their relationship to electoral politics. And the MST itself in Brazil is highly critiqued for the relationship to the left-leaning Workers' Party, which many leftists and leftist leaders in Brazil saying that the MST has indeed been co-opted, giving up their ability to organize large land occupations for the crumbs of the neoliberal state. And so again, I would argue that despite the nuances in the academic literature, this polemic that Piven and Clower gave us 40 years ago, that protest is the only effective form of social movement action, continues to be the central dilemma for social movements in the 21st century. And in addition, in education, we can't get away from those theories of social reproduction, but this idea that public schools will only inevitably reproduce economic and social inequities continues to be a huge sort of thrust of theory within education. However, this worry about engaging the state and the reproductive role of schools doesn't actually explain this picture. In this picture, you're looking at a public school. It's a public school that the MST has gotten legal recognition to exist within an illegal land occupation. Furthermore, the movement has gotten permission for the school to move with the movement of the movement. So in other words, today, this day, the movement was marching to the Capitol to demand more resources for their encampments. And the school was legally allowed to march with the march while being paid. So the school here continues to be a state public institution while actually increasing the capacity of the social movement to mobilize against that same state. And for me, this probably looks less like the state co-opting the MST and more like the MST co-opting the state, right? So back to the book. The big contribution I'm trying to make to social movement theory in this book is a move away on the one hand of an uncritical embracing of state negotiation, and on the other hand, a total idealization of protest as the only effective form of action. Instead, I tried to promote a positive theory of what I call contentious co-governance, which is when social movements engage in the provision of public services with state actors while simultaneously organizing contentious political actions and promoting practices that come into conflict with institutional norms and the interest of the state itself. So in other words, protest is not enough, but neither is negotiation. You need both of them over and over again, as I'm going to show in the rest of my talk today. A second argument I make is that contentious co-governance doesn't just get demands met, but it's actually a really good way to increase the internal capacity and long-term relevance of social movements. And third, contentious co-governance doesn't only happen under left-leaning regimes, but rather can happen in a diversity of context, including right-wing and conservative governments. In addition, I make some specific arguments about education. I argue that formal schools are strategic terrains for social movements to garner influence because they can help recruit new activists, and in particular youth and women, to the movement. They can help working class activists obtain state-recognized degrees that enhance their power to negotiate with elite actors. And probably most importantly, they can help social movements prefigure in the current world the social practices that they hope to build in the future. So I make all of those arguments based on 20 months of ethnographic research in 4 parts of the country. For every single minute of these 20 months, I've lived in the homes of MST educational activists, and I observed all of the activities that were part of the movement's educational struggle, whether that was teacher trainings or higher education programs or state activist negotiations or activist strategy sessions, or just like a day in the life of a kindergarten. In addition, I interviewed 200 people. Half of those people were MST activists, and then half of those people were state officials in order to understand that shifting dynamics of state-society relations. This is a multi-sided political ethnography because I do my research in multiple parts of the country, including 3 state-administered school systems in Rio Grande do Sul, São Paulo, and Ceará, and then 2 municipal administered school systems in the state of Pernambuco. I chose both cases of success where the MST was able to transform school systems, and also cases that were much more difficult, where the movement's gains were reversed, or where their participation was marginalized, or in the case of São Paulo, where the movement has never been able to transform the public educational system. It's, as you can see, it's a big book and it's a big project, because I'm tracing the history of one social movement over 35 years in 5 public school systems and at the national level, which involves hundreds of schools and dozens of educational programs. And so to give you sort of a map of the book, the first part of the book talks about how the MST developed pedagogies that supported their economic, political, educational goals. And then the second part of that part 1 really looks at how those pedagogies got implemented at the national level. And the second part of the book is where I do the comparison of the 5 school systems, and I really get into the nitty-gritty of how the MST works with state actors in different political and economic contexts, including extremely conservative contexts, to try to co-govern the school system. Today, I'm just going to talk about one chapter, chapter 2, which talks about one national educational program, the National Education Program for Education in Areas of Agrarian Reform, PRONERA. I'm going to focus on PRONERA because it's one of the MST's most important educational programs and victories, and also because it really illustrates this point I'm trying to make, that the co-governance of public institutions is a constant process of political contestation. Specifically, I'm going to talk about 3 struggles that surrounded PRONERA. One was massive protests and state opening, another was finding local allies and keeping them, and a third one was defending institutional gains. So with that, I'm sort of going to jump into the ethnographic part of the book. But before I can do that, let me just give you a little bit of context about what the MST's educational programs looked like in the mid-1990s. And also, can anyone figure out who that guy, the older guy, is over there? It's Paulo Freire, right? It's a very, very old Paulo Freire before he died. So just to briefly, by the mid-1990s, the MST had already developed dozens and dozens of educational programs throughout the country. This included literacy programs, child care programs, sort of like infant programs, and also, perhaps most impressively, the movement actually had its own high school they founded in 1990 that offered both a high school degree and a technical degree in teaching or cooperative administration. And so if you were an activist in the early 1990s without a high school degree, you would quickly be shipped off to this high school in the southern part of the state to get your high school degree through the MST's alternative educational pedagogies. So by 1996, the movement was able to publish this cohesive book about the MST's educational principles, which included both the philosophical and pedagogical principles of education, which I'm not going to talk about now, but I'm happy to talk about more in the questions and answers. However, in the mid-1990s, a big issue that the movement faced is that very few activists held a college degree. Although these activists were constantly studying in non-formal educational programs complex theories, in the eyes of the Brazilian state, they were still just high school graduates. And so I talked to one activist who told me why a high school degree was so important for her. And she said, when you're in the movement, you're an activist 24 hours a day. You're always at the disposal of the movement. It is hard to fit in the routine of formal education because you would have to stop your activism to study. Lots of people were doing this, leaving the movement because we had reached a ceiling for the level of education that activists could attain. The professors at universities would also not respect us. We had hit a limit because we did not have higher education. However, we did not want to study in any type of university. We started analyzing how we could offer higher education to our activists. And so this challenge that MST faced in the mid-1990s to get higher educational access brings us to our first struggle, which is massive protest and state openings. So in the mid-1990s, as many of you know, globally, but in particular in Latin America, governments were implementing neoliberal fiscal and monetary policies that were slashing social programs, eliminating tariffs, and often opening up local countries, local economies to international investment. And so Fernando Henrique Cardoso, despite his sort of dependency theory past, if you know him for that, when he got elected in 1995, he really represented this monetary and fiscal approach. And so in response to his election, the MST began to organize massive land occupations across the country. And although Fernando Henrique had said he supported agrarian reform in his election, once in office, he critiqued these land occupations, which really emboldened a lot of local elites to take action against the movement. And so on April 17th, 1996, in the northern state of Pará, state military police opened fire on an MST march, immediately killing 19 activists, what became known as the Massacre of El Dorado dos Carajás. This massacre was caught on film, which unintentionally sparked international outrage and a wave of support nationally for agrarian reform. So the following year, in February, the MST organized the National March for Agrarian Reform, where thousands of activists left from 3 corners of the country, and they marched for months. And then they arrived at the capital of Brasilia on April 17, 1997, the 1-year anniversary of the massacre, with 100,000 people supporting them. Under this pressure, President Henrique Cardoso had to respond. By the end of his first term, he had redistributed more land to landless families than the combination of presidents over the previous decade. In addition, these national mobilizations had a direct effect on the MST's educational struggle. As national leader Edgar Colin told me, education got a free ride, which called a corona, on the tail of these national mobilizations. On April 17, 1998, the 2-year anniversary of the massacre, Fernando Henrique signed into law PRONERA, the National Program for Education in Areas of Agrarian Reform. Thus, it was not a leftist government, but rather conflict and bloodshed that got the MST their most important educational victory. Which brings us to our second struggle, which is the struggle for finding local allies and keeping them. PRONERA was initially intended to be a literacy program, and indeed it expanded literacy across the country. However, the MST was not satisfied. They wanted to use PRONERA to renew their search for higher educational access. And so the activists began to go across the country asking public universities and their allies within them if they'd be willing to create an undergraduate program specifically for activists funded through PRONERA. Hey guys, we have money, will you partner with us? Every single public university said no. Edgar Colin, this national activist, he really interpreted this negatively, because although these professors would invite the MST to talk about their literacy programs, this idea that sem terra, that landless people, could come to the university to study as peers was just intolerable. And so the MST's search for higher education access might have ended there and then if it wasn't for one very small private university in the southern state of Rio Grande do Sul, the University of ljui, that had a history of working with social movements. And so because of this history, the professors at this university were enthusiastic about creating a bachelor degree program specifically for MST activists. And so in 1998, the first ever PRONERA higher education program started, what was called the Pedagogy of Land program, which included 47 MST activists from 15 states who would proceed to get a higher education degree in pedagogy over the next 4 years. The University of ljui was the perfect progressive institution for the MST to experiment with their educational initiatives in this new university setting. And so first what they did is they convinced the universities to organize a course through the Pedagogy of Alternation, where students would go and study for 2 months at the university and then return to their communities to do local community research projects or their activism that they were already doing. In addition, the movement supported student self-governance, collective work, collaborative living, integration of disciplines, manual labor, and social struggle. So for example, to integrate the disciplines, every semester they would have one overarching theme, like gender and work or agricultural cooperatives, and they would link all of their courses to that one theme. In order to have student self-governance, the cohort would divide itself into what are called base nucleuses, sort of like small base groups, who would be in charge of all the cooking and cleaning, and also the pedagogical aspects of the course. And so the course was really different than most university courses. And as Jose Cardarchi, a national leader, told me, although the base of the course was the university's curriculum, all of the extras, the spices, were from the movement. So the course went on, but over the series of different semesters, lots of conflicts began to emerge. And so some of these conflicts included professors who just refused to change their teaching practice, disputes over who had the right to define the curriculum, and then also conflicts between students. There was one student who no longer wanted to do the collective work, and so the professors supported his ability to transfer into a regular pedagogy program. And talking to one of the activists in the course about this incident, Elizabeth, she told me that it was then that we realized that the university did not understand us or our proposal because they supported and valued his decision 100%. But nonetheless, the conflicts happened, but the course kept going and it kept going. And it wasn't until the final semester that a conflict emerged that could not be overcome. More specifically, in the early 2000s, the Ministry of Education decided they were going to start a ranking system for all private and public universities, which required students to take the standardized test. The national student movement called for a boycott of the test. However, for the professors in this program that had gone out on a limb to support the MST, the test was extremely important for the course to have national recognition. The MST activists discussed and debated it, and they decided they would respect the boycott. Putting salt on the wound, they went to take the test, and they left all of the exams blank, which meant a failing grade nationally. The professors were so outraged. One of them told me they did not allow anyone to know about the decision. There was no dialogue. Another professor said, "We agreed to work with the practices of the movement. We did what the movement wanted, but the movement refused to work with the practices of the university." The MST never developed another PRONERA program at the University of ljui. So some of you look like a little shocked or disappointed, but actually, we should have expected these conflicts, right? This is sort of the idea I'm trying to capture when I talk about contentious co-governance, where these conflicts have to be expected, because contentious co-governance is when social movements engage in the provision of public services with state actors, while simultaneously organizing contentious political actions and promoting practices that come into conflict with institutional norms and the interests of the state itself. And these conflicts are bound to happen even under left-leaning governments and in progressive institutions, because the goals of a self-defined socialist movement are always going to conflict with the institutional norms and practices of governments and institutions in our capitalist and so-called individualistic and so-called meritocratic society. And so these conflicts could be expected. Nonetheless, despite these conflicts, the University of ljui is really important for opening the door to other PRONERA higher education programs. Over the next decade, dozens and dozens and dozens of universities, almost all public, agreed to partner with the MST to run more higher education programs. And then, when left-leaning Lula of the Workers' Party came to power in 2003, funding for PRONERA just skyrocketed, which led to dozens and dozens of more adult education, high school, and higher education programs throughout the country. By 2011, 3,323 students had graduated from more than 52 university programs throughout the country. Again, this is surprising because PRONERA was initially intended to be a literacy program, not an affirmative action program for land occupation participants. Yet what the MST did is they used PRONERA as a wedge to open the doors of other institutional spheres. And so in sociology, we're always talking about this idea of institutionalization, right? But institutionalization was not a passive monolithic process, but rather an active struggle, one of ongoing contestation, setbacks, and advances. Over the next decade, the types of PRONERA higher education programs expanded, with bachelor-level programs in history and math, and even an undergraduate degree in law, and graduate-level programs in adult education, cooperative management, development in Latin America. And in addition to this expansion of types of degrees, the type of educational process that these students were going through was very, very different. So for example, in the geography bachelor's degree program, students would learn about the geography of Brazil, economic geography, but they would also learn about productive alternatives for the Brazilian countryside, public policies and agrarian rights, studies of environmental impacts. In the undergraduate degree on law, they would learn about constitutional law and judiciary systems, but also historical and social context of legal systems, agrarian law from a peasant perspective, and legal structures of non-capitalist countries. In addition, every single PRONERA program was run through this pedagogy of alternation, with students studying for 2 or 3 months at the university and then returning to their community. And so this allowed for a constant relationship between theory and practice through research. So for example, in one of the graduate programs in infant education, one of the community periods, students were asked to go back to their communities, interview community members about their social values, and then build playgrounds that emphasize these social values. In another pedagogy program, for his final project, one student helped young kids find dirty, empty tins throughout the community, and he helped them create a band called the Banjo de Lata, or the Tin Band. And then for his final project, he theorized that process of creating that musical band. Every single student in a PRONERA program has to do this process of connecting theory and practice through research by first investigating their local reality and then creating an intervention to change it. In addition, and I can talk about this more in the question and answer, PRONERA got institutionalized as a program of triple governance, where you had to have both a university partner, the federal government, and a social movement that was legally running the program. PRONERA, over the past 2 decades, has really increased the internal capacity of the MST. As one national leader, Jean-Pedro Stedgley, says, PRONERA is one of our most valuable experiences we have. It is fighting against ignorance throughout the Brazilian countryside. Another MST leader said, these educational programs are pedagogical laboratories. They are privileged spaces because in no other space are activists together for an extended period of time discussing and creating theories for the movement. And my favorite, Maria de Jesus, who was in that first ljui program, said, now we have pedagogues, agronomists, lawyers, journalists, all of the professions in the countryside that are important for the working class. So again, PRONERA, over a course of 2 decades, transformed the MST from a peasant movement of middle school graduates to a movement of college graduates and graduate students and beyond. And it's exactly this ability of PRONERA to increase the internal capacity of the MST that has left it open to external attack, which brings us to our third and final struggle, which is the struggle to defend institutional gains. So in the mid-2000s, the MST partnered with the State University of Mato Grosso to create a PRONERA bachelorette program in agronomy. This program functioned like all the other programs, with students coming together for 2 months and doing all the collective work of the course. However, during this course, one of the students, again, did not like the collective work and began to critique it. And more so, he decided to send a complaint to the Federal Court of Audits, which is the auditing body attached to the Brazilian Congress, the TCU. The TCU came and they investigated the course, and they decided that the MST had an undue influence. And so in 2008, they issued a scathing judgment that said that the program was being administered without a public call or open selective process, which allows professors to be chosen by an organization that is external to public oversight, the MST, which abuses the principles of impartiality and morality. There was truth in their statement, right? However, instead of closing down PRONERA, what the TCU did, the Federal Court of Audits, is they created a series of restrictions on the program. They said that PRONERA programs had to happen through contracts, not partnerships. Professors could no longer be paid, and the participation of social movements was completely banned. And so although this didn't close down PRONERA, it made it impossible to run any more PRONERA programs for the next few years. And so what do you all think the MST did in response? Protested, right? They did not sit back and relax, but they got angry and they protested, and they mobilized their movement in defense of PRONERA. But what's interesting is the movement they were mobilizing now included hundreds of professors that became huge advocates of the program because they realized that PRONERA was a great way to get poor rural people into their university sphere. And so they mobilized, and the climax of the mobilization happened at the 4th National Seminar on PRONERA in November 2010, which I was at, where there were 600 graduates and professors who had participated in the program, dozens of congressional reps, and 59 university provosts, that's not professors, that's provosts, that signed a declaration supporting PRONERA, which stated, we are thinking about the social role of the university. The TCU is being absurd. Forcing a contract bidding process is ridiculous, not possible. Education is not a commodity. The central question is the autonomy of the university. Then the next day, President Lula signed a presidential decree and shook the hand of MST activist Vanderlucia Simplicio that basically made PRONERA a national law and also institutionalized the right social movements had to participate in the program. Under this pressure, the TCU had to respond. And so a few weeks later, on December 1st, 2010, the TCU issued a new judgment lifting all of the PRONERA restrictions, which led to dozens and dozens of new higher education programs over the next few years. And so, in conclusion, this story specifically of PRONERA, which again is one chapter of the book, really illustrates two arguments of the book. First, it shows how the creation and expansion of PRONERA shows how social movements' effective participation in formal institutions requires a combination of political advocacy and contentious protest, right? So I described three struggles surrounding PRONERA. First, to even get PRONERA, the MST had to put 100,000 people in the street. Then, to get university access, they had to find local allies to support them. But even with those local allies, there were tons of conflicts and tensions. And then, even under a leftist Workers' Party regime, they had to constantly defend PRONERA from outside attacks and mobilize against those attacks. Thus, again, institutionalization was never a freezing in the time of the MST's educational proposal, but rather a dynamic process that required both mobilization and political maneuvering to push forward institutional goals. And second, I think the case of PRONERA really shows how occupying formal institutions can help build a movement's organizational capacity and resource base. In a short decade, thousands of MST leaders obtained higher education degrees, including 50 students who graduated from a law program and became lawyer activists in the movement. Thus, I would argue that PRONERA defies Piven and Cloward's claim that it is not possible to compel concessions from elites that can be used as resources to sustain oppositional organization over time. In direct contrast, PRONERA has succeeded in integrating new activists in the movement, increasing both their political and technical capacities, and helping and allowing activists to prefigure in the current social world the type of community and society they want to live in the future. And I wish I could end there. Does anyone follow Brazilian politics a little? Some people, global politics, US politics. So throughout the world, countries have been going through a really big right-wing resurgence, and this has been probably most extreme in Brazil. And so I just want to spend, if you have 5 more minutes on you, I want to spend a little time talking about the current right-wing context in Brazil and how these arguments sort of hold up within this new context, okay? So just to give a little bit of background, these are the 2 Workers' Party presidents that are getting vilified there. But in 2016, President Dilma Rousseff of the Workers' Party, leftist Workers' Party, was forced out of office in what many people call an institutional coup. Her vice president and new political enemy, Michel Temer, became the president and immediately started reversing a lot of the Workers' Party's social policies. Then in October 2018, the global rise of authoritarian populism really hit Brazil hard with the election of Jair Bolsonaro, a former army captain who just weeks before this election had been a fringe candidate, known primarily for his exuberant endorsement of torture, killing and abuse, his vicious misogyny, homophobia, and racism, his loathing of the poor, and his catastrophic environmental policies. And so for a country that had become known globally for its social movements and participatory governance, the election of Jair Bolsonaro was surprising, disheartening, and just downright scary. And so the effects of this conservative resurgence have already affected the landless workers movement. Specifically, there's been a general attack on workers and poor families through austerity policies. There's been an increase in coercive attempts to repress the movement. There's been the passing of a policy that privatizes agrarian reform settlements, so community members no longer qualify for public services. And I'm sure you guessed it, there's been cuts in funding that supported the MST's initiatives, including the total end of PRONERA. And so despite those consequences, I actually want to end a talk for some reasons why for cautious optimism for the MST's future, even in this really dire context. So I'm going to end with some cautious optimism, 4 reasons for cautious optimism. the first reason for cautious optimism, I want to be actually cautious with this one, is despite the fact that Jair Bolsonaro said that a welcome mat for land invaders was going to be a bullet, he hasn't actually yet used that strategy of invoking the military and the police to repress local social movements. His hatred has emboldened others, so there's been like violent attacks against the movement from civilians who are emboldened by this hated rhetoric. I'm sure a familiar story we know. But his main strategy has been to starve the programs that previously supported the movement and use legal tactics against the MST's many agricultural and educational institutions. Most recently, he tried to shut down a MST school in the Northeast, the Paulo Freire Center. However, it went to the courts, and actually the MST just won the last recent judgment on the courts, and so it's possible that the judges will actually side with the MST. And if Bolsonaro continues to use these legal and resource strategies, the MST may be able to ride out the next few years. So that's reason number one. Second, untamed disruption. With the Workers' Party out of power, which the left-leaning party in power had really divided the left, and now the MST doesn't have to play this political dance with a leftist national government, but rather they can just protest. And so for the first time in years, you have all of the leftist groups in Brazil and all the different social movements together fighting in two popular fronts against austerity policies. So to some extent, having this really common enemy is uniting the left. So number two. A third reason for optimism is the youth. Today's MST is a movement of young people who grew up in settlements and camps and participated in MST educational institutions. And although many youth have left the countryside, a lot of them continue to be in the countryside, be in these communities, and they're really going to represent the future of the movement. In fact, I just visited Olivia. She's now 18, living still in a settlement in Pernambuco and still very active in the movement. And finally, and this is sort of the big point of the book, is that the MST is now engaging in this contentious struggle with a new arsenal of material, ideological, and socio-political resources, which have been a result of this long march through the institutions. So in the agricultural realm, the movement has already redistributed land to thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, and that land can't be taken back. In addition, the movement has created tons of agricultural cooperatives, and while federal support was critical for those cooperatives to get up and on the ground, now they're part and parcel of local economies. And so only if Bolsonaro takes a really repressive turn can he shut down those already viable initiatives. And of course, I would argue that education is the biggest sort of example of why institutional gains can't be reversed. Let's take PRONERA. It's over. However, thousands of activists have already gotten higher education degrees through this program, and Bolsonaro can't reverse those degrees. In addition, just one example, PRONERA actually inspired another higher education program, which was a teacher training program for people in the countryside, which the federal government actually launched under their administration, and they institutionalized in 40 universities with 10 tenured faculty in every university. So again, those are hard gains to take back. And finally, most schools are actually not run by the federal government, but they're run by state and municipal governments. And although Bolsonaro won the election in 2018, he lost the election in all of the northeastern and northern poorer states. In a lot of these states, leftist governments came to power, or sort of leftish governments. And although these governments might have been hesitant to work with the MST previously, now they're more open than ever before as a form of resistance against PRONERA. So for example, in the state of Ceará, the governor, after Bolsonaro got elected, agreed to create 4 massive high schools in MST settlements. And even more important than these political opportunities are the activists working in these schools. Everyone you see on the screen has gotten a higher education degree through PRONERA. So they know what they're fighting for it because they lived it for 2, 3, 4 years. And so PRONERA for me is what the late Eric Olin Wright called real utopias, which allowed MST educational activists to envision the contours of an alternative social world that embodies emancipatory ideals. Thus, again, these local activists now have a clear educational vision and a degree to legitimize it. And I'm just going to end with one ethnographic vignette. Oops. So in September 2015, at a gathering of 1,200 teachers in Brasilia, MST national leader João Pedro Stedley exhorted the crowd. The working class needs to organize its class project, and in order to do this, we have to organize in all spaces of social life. People don't understand power. They think we can just take the presidential palace and then have power, but there's nowhere in Brazil with less power than the presidential palace. The crowd laughed at the remark, all too appropriate as thousands of people across the country were calling for President Rousseff's impeachment. Then João Pedro pointed to a picture of Gramsci in the back of the auditorium. We prefer to follow Gramsci, who says that the people have to create their own social projects and contest power in all spaces of social life: the school, the land, the Senate, and the presidential palace. We are here this week to discuss how to continue one single chapter of our struggle, the conquest of knowledge and education. So in conclusion, the long march through institutions has never been about electing political officials. It's a much deeper form of engaging the state and promoting your social and political ideals in all institutional and state spheres. And in addition, the long march to institution is predicated on the fact that electoral sphere is unstable, and when some opportunities open, others will close. And so the MST itself was founded during a period of dictatorship, and they got some of their biggest gains during a right-wing national government. And although the left coming to power in 2003 opened up new opportunities at the national level, it did not change the MST's strategy of finding different access points within the state to push forward their social goals. So now with an ultra-right government, the movement's going to have to defend previous gains and find subnational arrangements to keep moving forward. And so now I think it's going to be the test. We're going to see the real pros and cons, consequences and benefits of the long march to institutions. So I think all eyes should be on Brazil. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions if you have any online and any in the room. If you could just raise your hand, I will let you call them. If you could just repeat the question so we get an audio capture of it, that'd be great.
Yeah, Rebecca.
Who decides the curriculum and the coursework?
So it happens in partnership between whatever so the PRONERA also has other social movements that have started to get involved. And so for every program, there's both a social movement and a university partner, specifically usually a program within the university. And together they design it. And it actually has to be institutional, it has to be approved as an official new course program for that university, which involves first writing the curriculum and the 4-year program and the courses, and then getting like the department and then the college and then the university to approve it as a new program. They actually have to go through our like bureaucratic curriculum initiatives, which is also like another struggle within universities. So but it's the social movement and the professors who do it together. Yeah. Yes.
How many of the lawyers actually went back, or has there been like going back into the agrarian as people leaving the movement, or do most people stayed around?
Thanks for the question. This is my father, by the way. He's visiting from DC. Did not want to say that? So I would. So how I describe the MST is salmon on a river, like going really strong in the opposite direction. So the reasons and the tendencies towards urban migration are really big. Poverty in rural areas is really big. So lots of people in the MST, especially young people, are leaving the movement. I would say maybe like 50% of young people will move to the city. And so what these programs are trying to do is they're trying to stop that trend. Like the main thing they're trying to get across is you can live a dignified life. You can be a farmer intellectual. You can be a lawyer, actress, do anything you want in rural communities. But they're definitely like fighting a different trend, which is rural to urban migration. Yeah, Jason?
And thank you for the talk. I always learn so much from you. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, one of the slides struck me when they mentioned autonomy. Mm-hmm. And we've kind of talked a little bit about this, but I want to ask a question, because it seems like right now, especially with Bolsonaro, and he has a plan, Cultura Se, which is placing a certain notion of autonomy at the center of his university reforms, which resembles things we know about here in the U.S., where autonomy means autonomy from the government and private investment, so on and so forth. And how this competes and how the MST offers like a counter concept of autonomy that's still confusing to me because there's a certain reliance on the government. So like, you could say a little bit more about, I think a lot's at stake in the notion of autonomy.
Yeah, and I would throw in there the notion of sovereignty.
Yeah.
As probably like the word that the MST would use even more than autonomy is like sovereignty. And this sort of comes back to the question of the MST's difference maybe with the Zapatistas, which is a Mexican indigenous movement that has chosen to be autonomous from the state, and so that's like almost a more clean-cut understanding of autonomy because they want autonomous institutions that they co-govern, and that they don't co-govern, they govern, and that are sovereign from the state. I think it's tricky with the MST, right? Because their argument is that as Brazilian citizens, like the state has the obligation to provide these public services to them, like schools and technical assistance and land reform, but that they are arguing that they have the right to co-govern or to have even like sovereignty over those public institutions, right? So it gets really messy because it's not this clean idea of sovereignty from the state, but rather even their concepts, like their biggest concept that they fight for is food sovereignty. So the right for local communities to produce the food that is healthy and is culturally relevant for their communities without having to rely on the market. That's sort of the definition of food sovereignty. But even that food sovereignty is like inherently dependent on state programs. Like it's dependent on the state countering trends in the market and creating programs that allow like local small farmers to sell their products to schools, or even for the government to buy up products directly. And so I think it's a tricky thing. I think with what's contentious about the contentious co-governance, and I talk about this a lot in my chapter 6 about Seara, is like even with supportive state officials, like who actually has control over the schools? Like who has the right to govern the schools? Like is it the MST? Because sometimes these schools, kids, daughters and sons of the MST might be 20% of the educational community. And so like who has a right to have sovereignty or autonomy over the schools? It's a constant sort of struggle and debate. So thanks for highlighting that. Yeah. Yes.
There was a slide you had in the very beginning that talked about was it student protesters, and it said quotas and quotas about whiskey. And I wanted to ask you, what does that what were the quotas that were in place of? Like do you know what that protester was speaking about?
Oh, in the very first one? Oh, that was for affirmative action policies. So quotas is quotas, which is in Brazil they passed policy. Brazil has some of the most expansive affirmative action policies in the world, but they passed all these policies where you would have to have like 50% black students within schools.
And the students were protesting against this?
No, they were protesting in support of them. They're like, because the critique of it's in flux right now, they're trying to cancel those programs, and the critique is that like people who get into universities with the quota system aren't strong students. I mean, you know the arguments, right? And they're like, that was actually an argument, we're quotistas, like we're quota students, and we're strong, and we're going to fight for our rights. So yeah. Good eye on that picture. But it was the reason I put it there, because I think it's like one of these many, I know I'm talking about the MST here, but the larger argument is that social movements throughout Latin America have used state institutions to push forward their goals. And so the black movements fight for quota systems, and affirmative action is like an example of that also. Yeah. And the indigenous movement, for example, they have their own parallel educational system also that is like funded by the state, but they kind of co-govern it in a way that's more messy than the Zapatistas also. So there's all these social movements that do it. And I think our US movements could also take some lessons and do some of this also.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask where you see this as being relevant
For the US.
for the U.S. Is it like issues like the Chicago teachers strike, where they were striking not just for higher pay, but for more money for the schools, additional programs going in, that would actually go into the communities?
Yeah. I think that's a great example. So there's a few examples I give, and we're like, how does this relate to the U.S.? And one example I give is the ethnic studies curriculum that the Mexican American movement developed in Tucson, which actually had some similar dynamics to this, the MST, where like Chicano activists created this ethnic studies curriculum that was using like Howard Zinn and Paulo Freire, and it was very radical. And they implemented it in the school. And it actually existed for 10 years, and no one really noticed or cared about it. But then Dolores Huerta went to Arizona, and she said something about Republicans hating Latinos, and it blew up, and a bunch of white politicians decided that this ethnic studies program was fomenting racism against white people. And then there was this big struggle where these young Chicano activists were occupying school boards, and they finally got that. And so the curriculum was ended. Freire and Howard Zinn were books that were banned from Arizona school systems, but then they fought back and they actually got it back recently. And so that for me is exactly what's trying to happen there. The Chicano movement there is trying to co-govern the schools through this ethnic studies program. So I think that's an example. I think Black studies programs and ethnic studies programs in the higher educational sphere who were born out of the Third World Liberation Movement in the 60s. I think that the new iteration, and this is my research now, I shifted over the past 2.5 years, and I now research teacher unions and teacher strikes in Brazil, Mexico, and the US. And so I think this new iteration of teacher strikes and actually activists within teacher unions that have taken control and see unions as a vehicle to think about new types of pedagogies in schools. A lot of these activists throughout the country have been leading the fight for Black Lives Matter's week of action in schools, where you actually have curriculum and pedagogy inside the schools. So I think you have these examples, but I think the problem is that in activist organizations in the United States, people are allergic to power. And they're oh my God, if we step into power, we're co-opted. It's too messy. We gotta have our perfect world, and we can create it outside of the state. And I think it's just not a long-term strategy for changing the world.
Yeah. I was thinking, giving away my age, if when the Black Panther Party set up preschool and after-school programs, if instead of just running them themselves, if they actually demanded money from the state of California, which should have been providing these services all along.
Yeah.
And then they would have had control in a sense over the curriculum, but they would have had the support of the state.
Yeah, and the Black Panthers did get some state money for some of their initiatives, so that's a great example. There's also this great book by Crystal Sanders that talks about how the civil rights movement in the South, in Mississippi, women who were leaders, sort of when the civil rights movement started to die down, these women took over Head Start programs throughout Mississippi, and they turned Head Start programs into sort of social movement schools that allowed these programs they had been doing to continue even after the civil rights movement died down. So, do you know that book, Jason?
No, I was going to say that just an interesting, we just hosted some of the people from Chicago, and they've been sending people to the MST schools, the training program, to figure out how to do what the MST was doing.
Yeah, this is the Chicago Teachers Union that are
Yeah.
sending people? I didn't know that the Chicago Teachers Union was going down there.
Yeah.
So a whole nother sort of aspect of the MST is that, I think this is important for your question, is that they have these attempts to co-govern state institutions, but they also have their own institutions. They have what I would call political education schools, that they call schools of formation, human formation, where rather than have a fight with the state over curriculum, they have 100% control. And in Sao Paulo, they have a national school, which over the past 15 years has become an international school for activists. And so for 10 years, they ran these 3-month social theory courses, Latin American social theory, where hundreds of activists across the continent would come and study together for 3 months. And then they would go back to their movements in their countries. But it wasn't just studying together. It was actually, they were prefiguring socialism in these schools through these different pedagogical interventions. And what Jason's referring to is 5 years ago, the movement actually started running one of these schools in English, these 7-week schools on political theory. And so you would have these schools of 80 activists from the United States, from Canada, from Palestine, from various countries in Africa, from Asia, who would come and study together at this MST National School, but through this alternative pedagogical approach. And the thing, I've talked to a lot of the US folks who go through those schools. I didn't realize that Chicago Teachers Union was sending people, but the thing they sent to me, I'm what do you, I was well, what was the impact of the school? What did you learn? No one ever talks about the classroom content. because content, it's important, but that's only one aspect. Like the most important aspect of these schools are like this prefiguration of like how to work collectively and the fact that everyone has to do manual labor for 3 hours a day, because the idea is that capitalism broke like this relationship between manual and intellectual labor, and so you all are intellectual laborers and don't have to do manual labor. But if you are a working class movement, everyone should do both. And so not only do you study, you also clean toilets and garden. And so people, I don't know if you have more reactions from them, but people really remember that sort of like the larger system rather than the content, in my experience. No. Did you have a follow-up thing you wanted to say?
No, I know they're deeply interested in the different movements that are going on, not only in Brazil, but across Latin America.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Thank you. Barbara, I'm Brazilian, and it's a pleasure for me staying here. And congratulations, your research is very impressive. I'd like to know how did the population in MST receive you? Because you were American and a professor. This is a good question, in my opinion. And what were your main challenges during the research?
Oh gosh. First of all, side note, my book is going to come out in Portuguese in July, hopefully. So I do realize that publishing something in English, it's most important to me that Brazilians are able to read and know about the work. So it will be out in Portuguese soon. So the MST is like very organized, and they have a system of vetting like international researchers. They actually have a thing called the International Relations Collective. And so to do research with the movement, you sort of have to contact like the International Relations Collective, and you have to explain what you're doing, and they don't really care about your academic credentials. They care about how what you're going to do is going to like contribute to the broader social struggle. And that doesn't have to be like, I'm going to contribute this and that to the MST, because the MST, they have their stuff, like they're okay. But it can sort of be how I framed it as like, I'm hoping that this research will shed light into like how these policies can help U.S. social movements. And it helped that my dad's a labor organizer for like the past 40 years. You know, I come from a family of activists. I identify as a scholar activist, and so I'm very committed to movements in the U.S. And so that really helped build that relationship. And once I had sort of the permission of the national group, they would put me in contact with regional people. And then, like, everyone was just warm and open. And people would make jokes that, like, Rebecca the CIA, which is, like, Rebecca from the CIA. But they'd always joke that I was, like, the best CIA spy ever because like, I loved, like, we all loved each other. And, 9 MST activists actually pushed my wedding a year and a half ago. We were able to help them, fund them to fly up for that. And that was, so I have, like, a very deep relationship with the MST. And I continue to participate in a solidarity organization called the Friends of the MST, which supports the MST in various ways and in various actions and hosts MST people when they're here. So I have a deep relationship. And we can talk about like what that means for being a neutral scholar and like having empirical research. And in this book, the book does not just say good things about the MST. It doesn't talk about like dirty laundry, because I think that's not appropriate. But it does talk about like challenges that social movements face. When people enter like a school system that's very like collective and feel like their individual rights are being stamped on and like leave the movement. So I talk about like tons. I talk about one case. There's one case I talk about where the MST is not able to transform schools, and it has nothing to do with the government, because the government says go ahead, transform them. But the people in the settlements who had occupied land 15 years ago hated the movement. Like, they had lost their connection. And they went to the government and said, we don't want the movement in our school. And so what I talk about is, like, if a social movement loses its connection to the base, all is lost. Like, you can't convince states to govern schools if you don't have the base with you. So that's actually the most important variable. I don't know if you call it variable. The most important context for being able to transform schools. So, what was most difficult about it? Everything was. It was great. It was wonderful. I learned so much living with the MST for 20 months. But it's there's tons of hard things. We can talk more, but negotiating gender and like relationships, like within very, like I lived in a very, very small community for 8 months that like everyone knew everything I was doing all the time, and they're like I would say like rumors got started about why I was there, and it was so sort of negotiating the fact that you arrive in a community and you're suddenly like you're suddenly you're changing the community with your arrival and negotiating that. Like it's impossible to be a fly on a wall if you're an ethnographer, right? So that was hard. I had some hard experience with state officials. So I would like interview state officials and I would tell them my research. But there was one case where like I explained to the state official about my research, and in a different moment he like found me. Like I was in an event that the MST had invited me to, and the state official was there also. And even though he knew I did research on the MST, he like got very, very angry at me. And he actually started yelling at me in front of like 200 teachers. Like, who do you think you are? You think you just show up? If I was in the United States, could I just show up? And like, so anyway, it was very emotional. I started crying. It was like a whole big thing. I like left the hotel. But then what was hard is that afterwards the MST didn't like this guy anyway, and so afterwards the MST is like, we want you to write a letter like denouncing the state official. And it's like, rule number one about ethnography, like don't. So like negotiating what to do around that, like how to respect the MST's request, and anyway, so yeah, lots of difficult stuff. Yeah. But mostly wonderful, fun, amazing experiences. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. Again, we'll close down for those of you online in respect to you who have taken some time off from work. For those of you in the room, you're welcome to stay a few minutes extra and have more conversation, look at the book. And please join us next month. We're meeting here again on March 18th, where we have Dr. Kim McClellan, who is an assistant clinical professor in College of Nursing and Health Practices here at Drexel. She'll be talking about her research with African-born women seeking HIV care here in Philadelphia, and their own group-mediated education experiences.
And just to emphasize, I don't think you should necessarily buy the book, but if you're thinking about buying the book, it's $55 online, and I'm selling $25 here, so yeah.
Thank you again.
Now or never.